Hello and welcome to District of Sports. I'm George Gerbo. A reminder to find us wherever you get your podcasts. Just search District of Sports wherever podcasts are found, and check out all of our sports coverage here at the Washington Times at washingtontimes.com/sports. It's rivalry week in college football, and Maryland will round out its disappointing 2024 season across the Mason-Dixon line at number 4 and 10-1 Penn State. And to break down the matchup, I am pleased once again to have back Joe Smeltzer of Nittany Sports Now to discuss the game and the potentially college football playoff-bound Penn State Nittany Lions. Joe, good to see you.
Yeah, good to talk with you, George, as always. And thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. This Penn State team seems to have overcome some of the, my word I'll use is defeatism. It always kind of feels like Penn State fans are waiting for what's the, hitting the ceiling, and we can't crack the ceiling of either getting to the playoff or getting in the national championship conversation. But as someone who's followed this team very closely, I think that setting the Ohio State loss aside, there are things in the build of this team and the makeup of this team that seems to have them primed to be more than just a Penn State team of old that wins double-digit games, goes to a New Year's Six type of bowl or Rose Bowl or Fiesta or whatever it may be. It seems like this team can be prepared and is prepared to do greater things when it comes to the playoff and advancing further than they have in past seasons.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is a Penn State team that's really dealt with, I won't say a lot of adversity. They've been pretty fortunate relative to what a lot of teams go through, but there's been some problems injury-wise, et cetera. Like KJ Winston, I think, was going to be probably an All-American first-round draft pick, maybe even the first safety taken off the board. He has a great game against West Virginia week 1. Then he gets hurt against Bowling Green, and he hasn't been back this season, and it doesn't seem like he will be back this season. And that's the only real major injury they've had, but they've had other problems, like the wide receiver corridor was a question mark all of last season, has only gotten marginally better. There hasn't been like a big upgrade as far as the receivers go. So that's been a big weakness that hasn't really helped Drew Allar out as much as a lot of people have wanted it to. And then more recently, they've dealt with some stuff on the offensive line. They lost probably their best offensive lineman, Anthony Donko. It doesn't sound like he'll be back this season on the defensive front. Alonzo Ford had suffered what seems to be a season-ending injury, and Penn State really only has 3 defensive tackles that have really done much of anything because Ford got hurt. Hakeem Beamon seemingly left the team. That's not confirmed, but he wasn't getting a lot of playing time, and as of almost mid-November wasn't with the program. But yeah, this team has had to fight through a lot of stuff, and that's really reflected in some of the games they won, namely the 2 close ones they've had at USC in overtime and at Minnesota this past Saturday by 1 point. Those are games that I'm not sure Penn State has the mental makeup to win in the past, and they're games that teams obviously have to win to make it far into the college football playoff conversation. And Penn State found a way to get those wins, and that's definitely a sign of a mature football team that knows really how to respond when it gets punched in the mouth. And Penn State's taken a few punches and come right back from it this year.
I had asked Mike Loxley, Maryland's coach, this week about that. Hey, they're coming off a 1-point game against Minnesota, the Southern California game, another close one, and he says, we control what we control type of thing. But is there any in those games, in those comeback games for Penn State, is there anything that looks like, oh, here's a crack that can be exploited, or it's just more about what Penn State has been able to do to overcome when they're set back, that they're able to get themselves back into a contest and also end up winning the contest and not lose those type of games? Because that might be Maryland's only best opportunity they have Saturday, is to try to exploit some things that either Penn State gets off to a slow start or has done something wrong, and maybe there is something in those tapes from the Southern Cal game and the Minnesota game that they could use.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, George, that was the same in both those USC and Minnesota games, what you mentioned, is that Penn State didn't start fast. Against USC, the defense got off the field when USC started the game with the ball and Penn State was able to force a punt. then the offense drove down the field, ended up settling for a field goal. But after that, Penn State punts and goes 3-and-out. They end up going up 10-0, and Penn State doesn't lead in that game, I don't think, until the fourth quarter. So starting slow has really been a problem for Penn State for most of the season. Against Washington and Purdue, it looked like they had really kind of bucked that trend. They offense scored all 4 times that had the ball in the first half against Washington, scored the first 2 times against Purdue, but against Minnesota, that slow start really reared its ugly head again. And then as far as like what you would watch on the film and notice, I think the big things on each side is if Maryland can exploit Penn State being shorthanded in the trenches. Anthony Donko is hurt. He was probably, if not Penn State's best offensive lineman, the starting right tackle. He was up there as far as their offensive lineman goes. He's a redshirt freshman, was getting better every week, and now he's going to be out for a long time. And Nolan Rucci has been a little inconsistent despite being a veteran guy. So maybe that's a weakness Maryland can exploit at right tackle. And then at the other end, Alonzo Ford was a big body that was getting a decent amount of playing time, playing behind the starters Zane Durant and Devon J. Thomas, and now he's out. And Penn State, as I mentioned, only has 3 real defensive tackles that have proven anything at the college football level. So maybe Maryland can have success running the ball between the numbers. Maybe they can tire Zane Durant out because Penn State really can't afford to have him off the field too much, and that's a guy that next to Abdul Carter might be their best defensive player. So I would say mainly those 2 things can be exploited. Just it's late in the season. Guys are getting hurt. Can Maryland take advantage of that? Who knows? But they gotta do something because a lot needs to happen, I think, for Penn State to not get the job done on Saturday.
Yeah, it's Maryland allowing just a hair shy of 130 yards rushing a game that's 12th out of 18 teams in the Big Ten. And Katron Allen and Nick Singleton have essentially, I mean, it's nearly identical. It's 600 plus yards on each side there. The numbers are essentially the same for both of them, and they've both, in the 2 games they've played against the Terps since they were freshmen, the first time being a 30-0 whitewashing in State College a couple years ago, and those guys have run the ball really well against Maryland. And Maryland on the Maryland side, they've struggled to even get a push defensively, where you're having to have the linebackers and even some secondary guys come in to help stop the run at the line of scrimmage, because the line hasn't been doing as good of a job of it. So it'll be interesting to see how that breaks down. You mentioned Drew Allar, and I wanted to touch on him because, of course, he comes in heralded 5-star and from Northeast Ohio, and he's got all the, can he do the thing? And I like seeing the maturity from him. And Maryland linebacker Kellen Wyatt said it this week that he's even his freshman year, he had you saw some of those things, and then sophomore, now in his junior season, his completion percentage, Joe's up like 10 to 12 points over last season. It seems like he's more disciplined with the ball. And of course, a lot of people don't consider Penn State to be, the passing attack like Ohio State and like maybe some other teams in like Oregon, some other teams in the Big Ten has, but to have a Drew Allar that is able to do those things and can be counted on, God forbid, if the running game is slow or sluggish here, it is seeing his improvement in that area is got to be special for Nittany Lions fans and the team.
Absolutely. And I think the 2 games where Drew showed that growth the most were the 2 games that Penn State almost lost, at USC and at Minnesota. Against USC, he had to fight through 2 interceptions that were both deep in Penn State territory. The defense was able to hold USC to field goals each time and kind of keep them in the game, but he ended up responding and having, I think, depending on how the season ends, that game-tying drive in the fourth quarter against USC might go down as one of the best possessions in Penn State history. He hits those 2 fourth-down shots to Julian Fleming, ends up hitting Nick Singleton out of the backfield for the tying touchdown, and then obviously Penn State gets the job done in overtime. And then against Minnesota, that kind of viral clip of Drew freaking out on the sidelines because he wasn't able to call timeout. Tyler Warren had to do a pooch punt, and we found one thing that Tyler Warren doesn't do very well. He only punted it 17 yards, I think, and Drew was visibly upset on the sidelines, but James Franklin did the right thing and calmed them down. And then on that last drive, Drew was lights out. Penn State needed to ice the game, and he did everything he had to do to get them to ice that game with the help of, obviously, his coach deciding to call a fake punt on 4th and 1, which ended up working out. But yeah, you're seeing a lot of maturity with Drew Allar. I think the biggest thing I still want to see in however many games he has left at Penn State is he willing to kind of try to get a completion to a receiver when a receiver isn't open? Because Penn State's receivers have had a very hard time getting open, and that's not Drew Allar's fault. But at the same time, I think there's some occasions to where he needs to say, okay, I need to make this happen when nothing's there. I would like to see that a little more. I think he's still a little too timid when he plays quarterback sometimes. But overall, when Penn State's needed him to be money, he has been. And I think even against Ohio State, the numbers might not show it, but he did very well in that type of situation. And unfortunately, he wasn't the one deciding to not use Tyler Warren at the goal line in that game, but that's a conversation for another day.
Penn State is favored by more than 3 touchdowns in this game. James Franklin has owned the matchup against Maryland. He, of course, knows Mike Locksley well. The two were on Ralph Friedgen's staff in College Park in the early 2000s. What has James said about Maryland this week? Because there's not too much that Penn State would need to be afraid of. Maryland still, and it's kind of crazy now in an 18-team league, they're still number 1 in this league in terms of passing offense. They average just under 300 yards a game, but a lot of those yards have come in the second half when Maryland's trying to get themselves back into games these last couple of weeks, and yet still what Billy Edwards Jr. has done, and he's been banged up and injured. What he's done this season is makes Maryland's offense the best passing offense for whatever that's worth, but they allow just as much passing wise on defense. And on the offensive side, and for the whole team, really, the one bright spot's been Ty Felton this season, who's set the season record for receptions. He's approaching the season record for yards. He's 140 away from Maryland's all-time yards record. He was a Blitnikoff Award semifinalist this year, so that's been the bright spot in his senior year, local kid for the program to have that. But what is Franklin preparing for or expecting Maryland to do on Saturday?
Yeah, as far as the history, which obviously we all know, Maryland fired one of his mentors, Ralph Friedgen, and then passed James Franklin over for the head coaching job. I don't know if that's something that a lot of Maryland fans, like, it's a sore subject for, or that's something they talk about, like, we really wish we hired that guy. But to
a certain group of the fan base, it is still a sore subject for the administration and the decisions that went down at that time, yes.
Yeah, and I could definitely see why that is, because who knows how the history of Maryland football looks if they end up hiring James Franklin and not Randy Edsall, or I think it was Randy Edsall. But yeah, as far as talking about Maryland goes, Franklin, when he talks about opponents, he mentions the coaching staff, the head coaching coordinators, and then talks about select players. Obviously, he mentioned Mike Locksley, touched on their history together. Obviously, they know each other well and knew each other way before either one started coaching in the Big Ten. He knows Josh Gaddis, the offensive coordinator. That was a guy that was on Franklin's staff and then left for Alabama and has coached at, it feels like, 10 different places.
Miami, Michigan, everywhere in between. Yeah. Maryland's offensive coordinator, who Locksley took play calling away from midway through the season after the week of the Northwestern game, after one of Maryland's buys, and it's had mixed results to say the least on it.
Aside from that, it really seems to be business as usual. And the one thing Penn State has to do is not forget about Maryland, which might be easier said than done considering Maryland's record and all the other stuff that Penn State fans are talking about, because it seems like the outside noise surrounds on everything but playing Maryland. So
I'll get you out of here on this one. The Terps, of course, left to play spoiler in this game, down as a 24.5-point underdog. And Kellen Wyatt, linebacker, said it this week, we're treating this as our bowl game. And even if Maryland were to pull some kind of wild, incredible upset, which is only the Terps have only won 3 times in the near 50 times these teams have met since in more than a century, over the last century plus. Even if Maryland were to pull some kind of wild upset, Joe, I would still personally, I think Penn State, even as a 2-loss team, would still be in the college football playoff. Now, they've got a backdoor to get in and play in Indianapolis in the Big Ten title game if they win and Ohio State loses to Michigan, which even the year Michigan's had, Buckeyes haven't won that game since 2019, I believe. So, you got a lot of, you throw out the variables when the game happens. But even if Penn State somehow were to lose to Maryland, and that could open up a door for Indiana to get back in the Big Ten title game, playing Oregon, who's already got a spot there. I would take a 2-loss Penn State team over all these 3-loss SEC teams we've been talking about. You've got the potential for Clemson to have 2 losses if they lose to South Carolina. You've got the potential for Miami to have a loss, and they're playing a tough Syracuse team. So there's a lot of flux that we're going to see over this final week of the regular season, of course, into conference championship weekend. But I think Penn State, God forbid, and I don't believe it's going to happen. I don't think many people do. But is there the sense, or does it feel like, nothing obviously is for certain until those final rankings come out, but does it feel like they're locked in and in a playoff position? Is that kind of the prevailing sentiment around the program?
I don't know about that. I think because of what happened in 2016, where Penn State, we're talking about sore subjects from the past, Penn State fans will swear up and down that they should have been in the college football playoff instead of Ohio State, and they have a right to feel that way with winning the Big Ten championship, beating Ohio State head-to-head. But because of that, I don't think fans really trust the college football playoff committee at all. I think Penn State fans would much rather, and the team obviously too, would much rather have the decision kind of out of the committee's hands, which the decision's always going to be in the committee's hands. But if Penn State beats Maryland, they're going to have no choice but to have Penn State in the college football playoff. If they lose to Maryland, you're definitely not getting a home game, and everything else I think is up in the air too. So I think a lot of people aren't even pondering the possibility of losing to Maryland because it's just so unlikely. But I think if Penn State does lose that game, there's not going to be a lot of ease within the fan base. People are going to be very unhappy, and I don't think there's going to be a lot of trust that the College Football Playoff Committee forgives that loss and gets Penn State in there anyway.
Joe Smeltzer with Nittany Sports Now. I appreciate the time. As always, let folks know where they can find you and find your work.
Twitter at NittanySN, at Joe Smeltzer775, and then all other platforms, the name Nittany Sports Now is the one to know.
Joe Smeltzer, Nittany Sports Now, I appreciate it as always. Thanks so much.
Yep, thank you, George.
And a reminder to find all of our sports coverage at the Washington Times at washingtontimes.com/sports. And you can find me on social media at Gerbo3 for all of your Maryland coverage and other sports going on in and around the DMV. I'm George Gerbo. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.